Greetings, students, and welcome to our next lecture entitled Critical Thinking on Socio-Political Questions. I'm Dr. T. Let's get started. All right, so in this lecture, we'll basically be covering the following. We're going to dig into the big questions of socio-political philosophy that I presented early in the unit. This will give you an opportunity to see where you stand in relation to the various thinkers we've covered so far. Also, you should make notes as you go through this section because basically it'll help you think through each of the topics as it relates to the ideal society that you will eventually be setting up, okay? You can think of this almost as your step one, kind of getting an early jump start on setting up your ideal society, okay, as you work through the thoughts and the ideas in this lecture. That being said, let's get started. All right, so big question of political philosophy: what should the government regulate? Okay. And so far, we've had different views from the early modern period, right? We had Hobbes, who basically said the government should essentially regulate everything. Okay. Every aspect of society should be regulated by the government or the sovereign state in order to assure peace for the people. Locke, on the other hand, gave a different perspective. He said, well, the government should have limited regulation, right? Basically, only things they should regulate: property, life, and things related to freedom. But other than that, the people should be free to do as as they please. Excuse me. And finally, Rousseau. He basically gave the argument that the government should essentially regulate whatever the people decide that they can live with. If the people decide that the government should have a lot of regulations or limited regulations, whatever they decide, as long as they can live with it, it should be up to the people because of his belief in direct democracy. Okay? So you know what the philosophers from the early modern period thought about this question. Now, what do you think of this question? It's your turn to basically examine your thoughts in relation to government regulation, okay? The next few slides are going to walk you through different areas of society that typically come up within this regulation debate within socio-political philosophy, okay? And I'm going to provide you with just a little bit of information on which what each side of the debate may sound like, okay? We're going to look at the particular area if we had regulation, if we had limited regulation, or if we had no regulation. That way you can truly consider where you stand, okay? That being said, let's jump in. So, first of all, guns within a society, okay? How much regulation should a government system have, okay? Now, if we think about this, if we have regulation on guns, the pros of this, of course, are there's some level of control or rules in relation to how people can access guns, the age in which they can get a gun, the usage of a gun, etc. Okay, how many guns can be purchased by one individual. These would be some of the things that regulations would do if people need a psychiatric exam or any other qualifications in order to get a gun. If we have limited regulations on guns in a society, it may say that, well, there's a certain age restriction, but there's no other limitations, right? I should still be free to basically have a gun as long as I meet this very basic regulation, which is being a certain age, okay? And finally, the view of no regulation, of course, would be, you know what? You should be free to have a gun if you wish to have a gun, okay? And you can use it how you wish within a society, and it's up to the people to basically decide to use their guns wisely, if you will, or to decide who should have a gun and all of those kind of things. Okay. Now, again, Locke would view this and say limited regulations because he would want to protect freedom. Hobbes, of course, would say it should be totally up to the government, and Rousseau would say it's up to the people. What do you think about guns within a society? I guess the first question is, in your ideal society, would you even allow guns? There's many societies around the world that don't, or they limit guns big time. That's not necessarily reflected, unfortunately, in American society, but that's a question you'll want to ask yourself in relation to your ideal society. And then once you decide if there are going to be guns, who's allowed to have them? Only the police, only certain people? What are the restrictions or the requirements? And how much say will your government, basically, in your particular system you're setting up, how much say will they have in how people acquire guns? These are the questions you're going to be asking yourself. Let's move on to the next topic. So, what about regulation of reproductive rights? Okay. If we look at regulations on reproductive rights, this could be things like being a certain age in order to get birth control, being allowed to get an abortion or not have an abortion, how many children you're allowed to have. All of these would essentially be the government putting in regulations in relation to reproductive rights, okay? Limited regulation would essentially be the middle ground on that, saying there's only some regulations, but deciding which ones those will be. And finally, if there were no regulations, what gets tricky about this is basically you can have an abortion or not have an abortion because there's no regulations about it. But also, if we think about the safety for using that particular example, of abortions, there might be no regulations even in relation to how an abortion is done. Okay. So I've had some people, when they think of reproductive rights, specifically think of abortion. And at first, they go to the extreme of saying no regulations, but then they think about the safety aspects and say, well, limited regulations because I want to allow people the freedom, is in Locke's perspective, to have an abortion if they so choose, but it should be regulated how it's done so that they can do so safely. Again, where you draw that line for yourself in your society will be up to you. And again, you can practice putting these different theories into practice. How would Locke view it? How would Hobbes? How would Rousseau view it? And that way, basically, you can see which one you align with most. All right. Next up is food, okay? How is our food regulated? It's something people don't think about maybe as often, especially in American culture, but there are societies that focus more on food regulation, okay? So, regulation of our food means who can produce food, the things you're putting in food, right? I know in some European countries, there is strict regulation assuring that the food is as high quality as possible, or not even allowing fast food in certain places. Okay, these would essentially be things that are regulating food, making sure there's no GMOs, all of those kind of things. All right. Now, limited regulation might be something, for example, saying that yes, people can basically produce their food however they want. They have to meet a minimum standard of safety, but the people are free to choose amongst different things. So, in a society where it's limited regulation, they might allow fast food or very sugary foods to exist and leave it up to the people to decide for themselves. Where in a society where there's strong regulation from the government, you leave it up to the government to decide and maybe take those things away from the people to protect them from themselves. And then where there's no regulation, people can basically produce food however they wish. And that includes essentially foods that are unhealthy, but and possibly foods that are unsafe. And you totally leave it up to the people to decide for themselves in that particular scenario. Okay. So again, Locke would say limited regulation, that, we can basically, you can create and be free to create the foods you want. Maybe you make sugary foods, but it's up to the people to decide. Okay. You can't just take those things away. Hobbes would say complete regulation, and then Rousseau would leave it up to the people. What do you think in relation to what role the government should play in regulating food? Education. This one has so many different ways you can look at it. Some basic examples. If education is regulated, you can have a standard curriculum across a society that's set up by the government, or at least the stipulations are put in place by the government. If education is regulated, people have to attend so many years of school, or follow a basic general standard, things like standardized testing, etc. All of these fall under education being regulated. Um, if you have limited regulations, you can basically say there's still some things the government, maybe they make a general standard, a light general standard across the board, but people are still free to kind of go above or below that standard as they wish. Okay. And then finally, if there's no regulation in education, then you may leave it up to the individual to gain education, or you could have different schools that teach different things, and you get to choose which school you want to go to, right? Even if we think about regulation in relation to homeschooling, there's some societies that allow homeschooling, there's some societies that don't. Should the government have a hand in if you want to rate, if you want to educate your own child at home? Should they have a say? Should it be limited, or should you be able to teach your child at home if you wish with no regulations and have that count as a consistent education system? Again, it depends on where you personally draw the line. All right. This one is an interesting one because people really don't realize, at least within American culture and with my typical students, they don't realize the power of the state and their hand necessarily in marriage or divorce, right? I'll give the exact example. I like I said, I spent a lot of time in Chicago, over 10 years there, and in Chicago, in Illinois, rather, I should say, essentially, in order to, once you're married, in order to get a divorce, you can't just get a divorce, right? You have to actually go through an entire process and get permission from the state in order to get a divorce. You have to live together for 2 more years, go to therapy, and basically try all the things before you're allowed to get a divorce. In this particular case, this would be a case where marriage and divorce, or at least the divorce aspect, is highly regulated by the state. Okay, that's just one example. Limited regulation might say that you just have to be a certain age in order to get married, but you can divorce as you choose. Okay, but there's still a requirement from the state in place. No regulation would be basically, you know what, anybody can marry anyone at any age, and you can get married and divorce as you so choose. Okay, there's pros and cons to each of these views, of course. You can think about how thinkers like Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau might weigh in on this particular issue, but then also think about your personal view. Um, some students, their natural inclination is to say, well, no, there should be no regulations, and the state should have no hand in who I marry, how I marry, or if I divorce. Some people have felt they'd like to have that regulation in place because it makes people maybe take marriage and divorce a bit more seriously if you know that there's certain things in place that are external to you, that you have to essentially follow versus just your whims of, I'd like to get married today and get divorced tomorrow. So again, it depends on where you stand in relation to that. Okay. Now, this next one, voting age or even other restrictions in relating to relation to voting. For example, here in the States, just recently, the laws have been shifting towards allowing ex-felons the opportunity to vote. Prior to the last year or two, if you were previously, or you're an ex-felon, then essentially you lost your rights essentially to vote. Okay, and this was basically coming from the top down from the government. Okay, so what do you think about regulations on voting? If we put regulations in place, then of course, like we have now, you have to be a certain age to vote. But some people have argued that maybe it would be okay. 12-year-olds, they live in this society too. Should they have a say in the world they live in, right? Um, it would regulate things like the age of voting, who can vote, the certain paperwork, or if you need a license or birth certificate and certain things to vote. This seems like it's a minimum standard. However, there's individuals who are homeless who don't have some of that information. They don't have a home address. They don't have a license. But should they still technically be able to vote? If we have strong regulation from the government that sets a really high standard, or even to some what they think is a minimum standard, these individuals are excluded. Some may argue for limited regulations with voting, and that may basically be you have to be a certain age, but pretty much you can vote if you're a felon, if you don't have a home address, if you don't have any other paperwork. If we think of a direct democracy, this would be kind of closer to that. And finally, no regulations. Pretty much that, I guess that would be the ideal of a direct democracy, like Rousseau presented. Everybody gets their say, whether you're a 5-year-old or 105, an ex felon, or you have a home or you don't have a home, you essentially would have the opportunity to vote because there is no regulations on voting. Okay. Now, some have argued you obviously need some regulation as to the voting process. So, again, in many cases, we end up somewhere in between with limited regulation, but how limited that regulation is, it will be up to you within your society. Now, in closing, I hope this lecture was essentially helpful in walking you through critical thinking in terms of this big question that looms over political philosophy of how much power the government should have. And in the one hand, I hope it helped you reinforce the philosophers we've covered too. If you were thinking about, well, how would Rousseau respond to this? How would Locke respond to this? How would Hobbes? However, as I also stated at the very, very start of this course, the reason that lectures like this exist is truly to push your critical thinking, right? Philosophy is an active discipline. So it's not just memorizing and regurgitating theory. I'm teaching you theory because I want you to be able to obviously embrace these different ideas and learn them generally speaking. But philosophy is also learning to implement and develop your own thoughts in relation to these ideas, right? That's as essential to philosophy as the theories themselves, all right? Is the critical thinking you do in relation to the theories. All right, that being said, we've come to the end of our lecture. As usual, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Take care. Thank you.